On a crisp October morning in Elmridge, the hiss of coffee brewing and the crackle of AM radio filled Franklin Wade's kitchen. Just another quiet start to a quiet day. Until the tow truck arrived. The scent of dark roast drifted through the small kitchen, mingling with the aroma of toasted wheat bread and the faint musk of old paper. Franklin stood by the counter in his flannel robe, staring out the window as golden leaves danced across his driveway. Beyond the maple trees that lined his modest front yard, the town of Elmridge was beginning to stir. Somewhere a dog barked, a screen door creaked open, and the muffled thump of a newspaper hit a porch. He took a sip from his mug and let the bitterness settle on his tongue. The same mug he'd used every morning for over 2 decades, with the same worn phrase etched in fading blue. Justice is calm. He never liked attention, never chased it, but it always had a way of finding him, especially when injustice knocked first. The voice on the AM radio gave the local harvest forecast. Cooler temps today, folks, with a high of 62. If you're heading to Johnson's Orchard, bring a sweater. Franklin reached over to turn down the volume, the familiar static fading as he glanced toward the framed photo on the sideboard. His wife, Eleanor, smiled softly back at him, her hands folded in her lap, sunlight in her hair. Gone 5 years, but still the anchor of his silence. Then came the sound. A metallic clatter broke the peace, a harsh grind of gears followed by the unmistakable hiss of hydraulics. Franklin's eyes narrowed. He stepped slowly to the front window, steam rising from his mug as he stood motionless behind the glass. Across the street, a bright white tow truck idled loudly at the curb, its lights flashing in stark contrast to the sleepy autumn street. The driver, a young man in a neon vest, was already hooking chains to the rear axle of Franklin's old Ford pickup. A second later, the front wheels lifted clean off the ground. No knock on the door, no courtesy call, just action, just removal. Franklin opened the door, letting in a burst of cold air. The wind carried with it the scent of damp earth and burning wood. He stepped out slowly, his slippers brushing against the fallen leaves that blanketed the path. The tow driver didn't look up until Franklin was nearly at the curb. "You can't park here anymore, sir," the man said, barely meeting his gaze. "HOA order. This vehicle was reported for violation. I've got the paperwork." Franklin didn't reply. He simply held out a hand. The driver fumbled for a clipboard, handed over a sheet of printed regulation. At the top, complaint issued by HOA President Karen Holloway. Below it, a line about unsightly vehicles violating community standards. He scanned it briefly, his eyes pausing on the date, just yesterday. "You just got the order this morning?" Franklin asked, voice even, low. "First thing, boss said to move quick." Franklin nodded once, then stepped back. "Carry on," he said. As the truck rolled away with the Ford in tow, the sound of its departure echoed louder than it should have. Franklin stood alone on the sidewalk, hands in the pockets of his robe, the morning air curling around him like smoke. Behind him, Sally Pearson watched from her porch, one hand on her hip, the other holding a mug with a knitted sleeve. She didn't wave, just shook her head slowly and mouthed, "Unbelievable." Inside, Franklin laid the sheet down next to his coffee. He returned to his seat at the kitchen table, flipping the folded newspaper open, but barely reading it. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed. A new post in the neighborhood Facebook group. He tapped to open it. Karen's profile picture smiled back, her signature pearl earrings and perfect bob. The post read, "Friendly reminder, all residents are expected to follow HOA guidelines. Parking violations will be enforced without exception. Let this morning's incident be a fair warning." Franklin stared at the screen for a long time. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked up at the photo of Eleanor again, then reached for the newspaper. He folded it carefully, lined the edge, and set it down with quiet finality. He stood and walked toward the hallway, his steps slow, deliberate. Just before he disappeared around the corner, he said almost to himself, "Well then, it begins." Karen Holloway wore victory like perfume, strong, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The next morning, Rosie's place was already buzzing before the sun had fully crested over the oak trees of Elmridge. The bell above the door jingled every few minutes as locals came in, shrugging off jackets and rubbing their hands to shake off the October chill. Old men lined the counter, sipping black coffee and muttering about the upcoming harvest fair, while the back booths filled with women in cardigans, exchanging small-town gossip over buttery biscuits and apple jam. Franklin Wade sat near the corner window, a seat with a good view of the diner's interior and the quiet street outside. The table was clean, the laminated menu untouched. A slice of sweet potato pie and a steaming cup of black coffee sat before him. He stirred in a packet of sugar without looking, his eyes following the rhythm of the town as if it were an orchestra he knew by heart. He had seen this kind of power before, in courtrooms where rules were bent and justice delayed. It had the same smell of smug certainty, the same smug smile worn by people who thought they couldn't be touched. And now, here it was again, walking through the diner door in the form of Karen Holloway. She entered like a headmistress late to her own lecture, back straight, coat pressed, lips painted in a sharp red line. A few people nodded her way. She returned the gesture with an air of benevolence, like a queen acknowledging her loyal subjects. As she passed by Wade's booth, she didn't look his way. She didn't need to. In her mind, he was already dealt with. "Morning, Judge," said Sally Pearson, sliding into the seat across from him, with a wry smile and a cinnamon bun on a plate. "You know I'm not a judge anymore," Wade replied without looking up. "Well, maybe not on paper," she said, breaking off a piece of the bun. "But that look on your face says you're already building a case." He gave the faintest smirk and took a sip of coffee. "She held an emergency HOA meeting last night," Sally continued. "Tighter rules, more fines. She's got them all jumpy now. Said it's for community order." Wade nodded slightly, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "I've been reviewing the bylaws," he said, placing it on the table. "There's no provision that permits towing without notice unless the vehicle is deemed abandoned for more than 72 hours. Mine was parked there for 24 hours. "Figures," Sally said, shaking her head. "She pulled the same trick on my garden last year. Gave me a violation because the mums were too overgrown. They were blooming." "Colorful violation," Wade said, lips twitching slightly. "She calls it order," Sally said. "But it's just control." Across the diner, Karen spoke with a small group near the counter, laughing a little too loudly. "We all have to follow the rules," she said, just loud enough for most to hear, "even if some people think they're above them." Wade said nothing. He didn't need to. Later that day, the group chat, Elmridge Neighbors, started pinging with posts. Someone had uploaded the HOA memo Karen had handed out. Another commented, "Is this even legal?" Then came an old screenshot. 3 years ago, Karen had ignored a similar parking situation for a board member's son. By evening, the discussion thread had grown to dozens of comments. Sally added her own story, complete with a photo of her overgrown mums, and others chimed in. An elderly couple wrote about their mailbox being deemed too rustic. Someone else shared how their grandson was reported for loitering while skateboarding in front of their own home. Karen posted in response, "I only act according to the rules. If people have a problem with that, perhaps they should revisit the handbook they agreed to when they moved in." That same night, Franklin visited the impound lot on the edge of town. The man behind the glass booth looked up, half interested. "Need your plate number?" he asked. "No," Wade said calmly. "You'll find the truck under Holloway's directive, dated yesterday." The man blinked, then scanned his clipboard. "Yeah, here we go. Pickup, gray Ford, HOA order." He started pulling the keys off a hook. "I'll need a receipt," Wade added, folding his hands behind his back. "Sure thing," the man replied, printing the form. He handed it across the counter. "Not a lot of folks show up this calm." "I've learned," Wade said, taking the paper, "that calm gets more done than shouting." The next morning, Wade returned to Rosie's place, parking his Ford neatly in the driveway, precisely within regulation. He stepped inside and made his way to the same booth by the window. The pie arrived a few minutes later, warm, topped with a dollop of cream. Sally slid into her usual spot, eyeing the truck outside. "She saw it this morning," she said, lowering her voice. "Nearly choked on her peppermint tea." Wade's expression didn't change. He stirred his coffee and took a bite of pie. Sally leaned in. "She still doesn't know who you are." "Does she?" Wade answered, lips barely curving upward as he brought the cup to his mouth. "Not yet." Franklin Wade hadn't opened his old case files in over a year. That changed today. The lamp on his desk gave off a golden glow, casting long shadows across the room. It was the kind of quiet only October nights in Elmridge could offer. No cars, no chatter, just the rustle of leaves against the windows and the faint groan of old wood settling. Wade sat in his study, surrounded by shelves lined with legal journals, binders with faded labels, and a wall clock that ticked like a courtroom metronome. The door was closed. The world outside was paused. He reached for a familiar manila folder, its edges soft from years of use. His fingers hesitated at first, brushing the top like it held something sacred. Then he opened it and began to read. Names, dates, notations in crisp handwriting. A pattern he remembered all too well. Selective enforcement, targeted citations, systematic pressure. The law wasn't just his career, it was his craft. And Karen had just stepped into his arena. An hour passed, maybe two. Wade barely noticed. He moved between folders like a surgeon reviewing old case files before a major operation. His eyes sharpened with every page. He made a list: dates, violations, names of residents. Most of them were widows, veterans, or Black and Latino families. The pattern wasn't a coincidence. It was a design. The phone on the side table buzzed once. No caller ID. He picked it up without hesitation. "Judge Wade?" a voice asked, low and professional. "Former judge," he corrected gently. "Of course, but we know who you are. You flagged something in the Elmridge HOA system?" "I did." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "We've been watching that region. You've just handed us a very compelling case." Wade didn't reply. He didn't need to. "We'll open an internal review, discreetly for now. You'll hear from a federal liaison in the next week." "Understood," Wade said, and the line went dead. He set the phone down, exhaled slowly, and reached for another folder. Later that night, a soft knock at the back door interrupted the silence. Wade opened it to find Sally standing there, bundled in a thick sweater, a brown envelope under her arm. "I thought you might want this," she said. "HOA bulletins from the past 5 years. I kept everyone. Habit." He took the envelope with a nod. "Anything in particular I should look at?" "Page 3 of the June 2020 issue," she said, already turning to go. That's when Karen started signing her name in bold. Wade returned to his desk, slipped the newsletters free, and scanned them. There it was, a gradual but clear shift. Early issues spoke of community cooperation. Then, suddenly, it was compliance and enforcement. The tone grew colder, the citations more frequent. The transformation of Karen's rule wasn't sudden. It was strategic. He flipped open his laptop, typed a draft. Petition for Civil Oversight Review. Homeowners Association Conduct. He attached scanned copies of the most questionable violations, flagged comments from the group message board, and added the list of names Sally had helped him compile. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the page. He signed it, then paused. At the bottom, in a box marked Filed By, he typed, "Franklin Wade, Federal Retired Judge, District of Columbia Circuit." He stared at the screen for a long time before hitting send. 3 days later, a cream-colored envelope arrived at the HOA office, hand-delivered, marked, "Federal Document Time Sensitive." Karen Holloway was in the middle of reviewing lawn regulation complaints when she noticed it. She opened it casually, sipping chai tea, lips curled in a smug half-smile. Then her eyes reached the bottom of the first page, and her fingers went stiff. The letterhead read, "United States District Court." It was a subpoena. She flipped to the last page, the one that held the signature. There, printed in firm black ink. Judge Franklin Wade authorized signatory for preliminary review. Her mouth parted slightly. A chill pricked the back of her neck. "Why does that name sound familiar?" she whispered. Karen Holloway prided herself on control, until the control turned against her. The sun had barely risen when she arrived at the HOA office, but the parking lot was already emptier than usual. A fine mist clung to the ground, coating the windshield of her Lexus with a pale film. She wiped it away with the sleeve of her coat, muttering as she unlocked the office door. Inside, the air felt colder than it should have. The scent of her lavender candle, usually a staple of comfort, now seemed faint and sour. She tossed her purse on the desk, straightened the stack of newsletters, and reached for the day's mail. Her hands paused when she saw the envelope, cream-colored, heavy, embossed with the seal of the United States District Court, the same as before. Her throat tightened as she tore it open. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't going away. She scanned the page. You are hereby summoned to appear at a formal hearing concerning violations of federal civil rights law under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. Her name was printed clearly. The same cold precision she used in her HOA fines now stared back at her. She stared at the signature line again. Judge Franklin Wade. No title was more damning than the truth she'd ignored. In the quiet of the office, her composure began to crack. She opened her laptop and fired off a message to the HOA board. Urgent meeting, today at 4 p.m., attendance required. Her fingers shook as she hit send. Across town, Rosie's place was alive with chatter, but the tone was different now, softer, cautious. A new post had just gone live in the Elmridge Neighbors Facebook group, a grainy photo of the envelope Karen received with a single caption. Is she being investigated? Within an hour, it had over 50 comments. At table 4, Sally stirred her coffee, eyes on the screen. It's starting, she murmured. Sheriff Dan Wexler stepped into the diner a few minutes later, nodding toward Sally before sliding into a booth nearby. Wade was already seated. The sheriff took off his hat, setting it on the table. She called me last night, Dan said, voice low. Said there's been a misunderstanding, asked if I'd confirm her actions were legal. And did you? Wade asked, calm as ever. I told her I wasn't in the business of defending technicalities, especially not ones that smell wrong. Outside, the leaves rattled in the wind, and someone slammed a car door with a little too much force. Wade took another sip of coffee. That afternoon, Wade walked into the HOA meeting without a word. No one expected him to show up. Not there, not in person. But when he entered the room, chairs scraped the floor, and the low murmur of conversation vanished. He took a seat in the back, folding his hands in his lap. Karen stood at the front, posture stiff. Her usual confidence felt like a costume that no longer fit. She cleared her throat, motioned toward the overhead projector, and started to speak. We've had an unfortunate misinterpretation of HOA policies by an outside entity, she began. This is clearly politically motivated. A smear campaign against my leadership. Someone coughed loudly. Another whispered something and left the room. Karen's eyes darted around. I will not be intimidated, she said, raising her voice slightly. Nor will I allow this community to be divided by individuals seeking personal revenge. That was her cue. Wade stood, slow and deliberate. The room held its breath. This isn't personal, Ms. Holloway, he said, voice firm but without malice. This is overdue. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. By nightfall, 2 members of the HOA board had resigned, citing a need for transparency and renewal. Sally's house buzzed with voices, neighbors sharing old stories, reading past violation letters, comparing notes. Karen drove home in silence. The roads were empty, lined with trees whose leaves now seemed dull and lifeless under the dim streetlights. As she pulled into her driveway, her eyes caught a shape tucked under her windshield wiper. Another envelope. She froze. She stepped out, heels crunching on gravel, and carefully slid it from under the blade. The envelope was thicker than the first, stamped across the top in bold red letters. Federal subpoena, obstruction of civil rights. She opened it with trembling hands. Her eyes moved to the bottom, where the seal gleamed under her porch light. United States Department of Justice filed by Judge Franklin Wade. Her grip loosened. The paper fluttered to the ground as she stood motionless in the dark, and the air around her no longer felt like her domain. The louder Karen shouted, the quieter the town became. Her voice cracked against the microphones in the town hall press room. The local station had agreed to give her 5 minutes on air, thinking it might ease tensions, maybe help balance the narrative. But as Karen Holloway launched into her practice speech, blaming lies, social media mobs, and a campaign to smear her good name, the people of Elmridge simply stopped listening. At first she had believed volume would win, that the louder she insisted on her innocence, the more people would return to her side. But silence, cold and steady, answered her instead. The camera light stayed on. The anchors remained politely neutral. But the eyes of the town had already turned away. In the Facebook group Elmridge Neighbors, the comments under the live stream stacked up by the second. She fined me $300 for my shed being painted the wrong shade of white. Told my mother her wind chimes were a public nuisance. My late husband got a letter for parking his medical transport van in our own driveway. They came like a flood, residents who had long felt alone in their grievances now finding their voices. Screenshots, scanned citations, even copies of formal warnings, dated, signed, and sanctioned by Karen Holloway, circulated like wildfire. Her authority, once wrapped in neat fonts and legalese, was unraveling line by line. That night, the community center filled to the walls. Folding chairs scraped the floor as they were added row after row. Sally Pearson stood near the front, clipboard in hand, greeting neighbors with her usual warmth. She wore a maroon cardigan and sensible shoes, but her voice, when she addressed the crowd, carried the weight of steel. "Tonight isn't about vengeance," she said. "It's about truth and dignity. Let's speak plainly together." One by one, the townspeople stood and shared. A widow who had lost her gardening permit because her rose bushes grew beyond acceptable symmetry. A Vietnam veteran who had been warned 3 times for flying a flag that was too large. A young couple whose daughter's sidewalk chalk was deemed graffiti. Even the local priest spoke, recounting how the church's donation box had once been flagged as unsecured property. And through it all, Franklin Wade sat in the front row. He didn't take notes, he didn't speak, but his presence was like a quiet seal on the proceedings, a confirmation that what was being said mattered, that someone, somewhere, with authority, was listening. Karen arrived halfway through, flanked by 2 board members still loyal, barely. She didn't take a seat. She stood at the back, arms crossed, her eyes flicking from speaker to speaker, jaw clenched tighter with each testimony. When the final speaker sat down, the room went still. Then the board chair stood up. "We've heard enough to take this to a vote," he announced, voice formal but tired. "This motion is to suspend Karen Holloway from her position as president of the Elmridge HOA, effective immediately, pending further legal investigation." Hands rose, rows of them, so many, so fast, it was like a wave. Only 3 remained down. 90% in favor, the chair said. Karen snapped forward, her voice shrill. "This is a farce. You're letting a bunch of nobodies, liars, and gossip mongers tear down years of service because of one man with a grudge." But no one turned to her. No one answered. She was yelling into the void. The board chair simply nodded to the room. "This meeting is adjourned." Karen stormed out, heels clicking sharply across the linoleum floor. Wade watched her go, eyes calm, hands folded in his lap. The room behind him filled with murmurs, relief, disbelief, the soft beginnings of closure. Outside, night had fully fallen. The wind picked up through the sycamores. Karen reached her car, slammed the door, and sat for a long moment in silence. Then her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She answered anyway. A voice on the other end spoke clearly, with no emotion. "Federal charges. You've been indicted." Autumn came full circle in Elmridge, with justice, not judgment, leading the parade. The harvest fair returned like it always had, but this year it felt different, warmer, truer. Under strings of soft yellow bulbs and the gentle flutter of red and amber leaves, the town gathered. Families, old friends, neighbors who hadn't spoken in years, but now shared laughter over cider and slices of pie. Franklin Wade walked the gravel path through the fairgrounds with the same quiet step he used to pace court aisles. But today, people called out his name, not as a title, not in reverence, just in recognition. "Morning, Judge. Good to see you, Franklin. You made it." Their hands extended not for judgment, but gratitude. Near the hay bales, children lined up to paint pumpkins. Across from them, Sally Pearson manned a pie booth, her apron dusted with flour, cheeks pink from both the oven and the joy of being seen. She caught Wade's eye and waved him over. "Sweet potato or apple?" she asked, already slicing. "I trust your judgment," he said with a slight grin. "Dangerous thing to say to a woman holding a pie knife," she replied, handing him a generous wedge wrapped in parchment. The soft hum of a fiddle tune floated from the stage where local musicians played songs older than most of the instruments they held. It was the kind of music that didn't demand attention, but earned it anyway. Sally leaned on the table, lowering her voice. "Karen's house went on the market yesterday. No one's touched it. The sign's already leaning." Wade nodded slowly. "Some things fall faster than others." The headline on that morning's town newsletter still sat folded in his coat pocket. Elmridge HOA restructured after federal indictment. No bold colors, no sensationalism, just the truth, the way he liked it. He excused himself a while later, wandering past the booths until the fair noise gave way to the hush of the hill behind St. Andrew's Chapel. There, beneath a tree whose golden leaves barely clung to the branches, sat the grave of Eleanor Wade. The stone was simple, but elegant, just like her. He crouched down and placed a bouquet of mums and asters at the base, along with the folded newsletter. The wind caught the corner, lifting it slightly before it settled. "We did all right," he said softly. A voice behind him made him turn. "Sir?" A boy, no more than 12, stood holding a half-eaten pie and a hopeful expression. "Thanks for standing up for us." Wade smiled, stood, and offered his hand. "Didn't do it alone." The boy hesitated, then asked, "Will you teach me how to stand up for others?" Wade's smile widened as he looked down at the boy's plate. "Only if you bring pie next time." In the quiet after the storm, Elmridge found its way back to something simpler. Neighbors sharing laughter over pie, not whispers over fences. Justice didn't arrive with noise or anger, but with calm resolve and truth that spoke for itself. When power is used to divide, it takes only a few voices, steady and honest, to bring a community back together. A legacy isn't written in bylaws or control. It's built in how we stand for one another. Like autumn leaves returning each year, the roots of fairness run deep if we tend them with care.